to Geneva by saying the mountain climate will be good for your health, brother. Calvin responded to Verret this way. I read that passage of your letter, certainly not without a smile, where you show so much concern about my health. It would have been far preferable to perish once for all than to be tormented again in that place of torture. But he went anyway. He went anyway because Calvin did not pastor where he would be most comfortable, but where he would be most useful. That's Calvin. He was a willing sufferer, and by doing that, Calvin practiced what he preached. He wrote in his Institutes, quote, "Each must bear his own cross, for whomever the Lord has adopted and deemed worthy of his fellowship ought to prepare themselves for a hard, toilsome, and unquiet life, crammed with very many and various kinds of evil. It's the Heavenly Father's will thus to exercise them." Beginning with Christ, his firstborn, he follows this plan with all his children. And why should we exempt ourselves from that? Calvin knew the crosses are not without purpose. We share Christ's sufferings, he said, in order that as he passed through this labyrinth of all evils into heavenly glory, we may in like manner be led through tribulations to the same glory. When they were evicted by the angry, hot crowd in Geneva, 1538, Calvin wrote Farel, "If we had been serving men, we had been badly rewarded. However, we serve the one who never withholds from his servants which he has promised them. Beyond measure, the Lord cares for us, his servants." And as Calvin would have said to us, by these sufferings, God trains our eyes on the life to come. He was a willing sufferer. He was personally upright, first. In the second place, he was a willing sufferer. In the third place, he was a wise, sympathetic pastor. A wise, sympathetic pastor. Ask Calvin once what he would identify himself as. Scholar? Theologian? Church reformer? Dogmatician? Liturgist? Catechist? Disciplinarian? He would have said, no, I am the pastor of the church in Geneva. To describe Calvin as anything other than a pastor, to describe Calvin as something other than pastor would be like writing a biography of my dear wife or yours and saying about her, she was an excellent cook, she was a marvelous seamstress, she was a tireless housekeeper, without saying, first of all, she was a mother and a wife and a grandmother. Calvin may have been a theologian. Calvin may have been a scholar. Calvin may have been all of those other things that will describe him as he was. But Calvin would have said, I am a pastor of the Church of Christ in Geneva. And though initially unwilling, Calvin was not of a mind, after he became a pastor, that many are today, aspiring to gain a reputation as a theologian, as a scholar, as an author, and take a year break or leave from the congregation with a fat study grant. I don't want to leave my sheep. I am, Calvin would have said, a pastor. Even though pastor encompasses really the whole of his ministry, I focus for our purposes this afternoon on two aspects of that. He was a wise and he was a sympathetic pastor. First of all, he was a sympathetic pastor with a heart that yearned for the good of the people under his care. And what a worthy model he was in that regard. I was so struck in all my reading, and those of us who are preparing to speak this week on Calvin did more than a little reading in Calvin and about Calvin. I was so struck in my reading with that one fact that I had more notes on the sympathy of Calvin and the sympathetic nature that he had than all of the other notes that I had put together. I could make 2 or 3 speeches just on that subject. The sympathy, that this man of God had for the sheep under his care. That sympathy showed itself in especially 4 areas. First, he had a care for the poor, for the orphans, for the widows, the elderly, and the sick. And in Geneva, there were many. Most people don't associate Calvin with compassion for the destitute, but under Calvin's influence, the office of deacon in the church was restored. The office of deacon came to its own again under the influence of the Reformers. Contrary to some modern caricatures, the Reformers generally worked diligently to minister to the poor. Some believe that his mercy ministry had as much influence in the society of Europe